Well, we've had several talks comparing Shakespeare and Cervantes, and I'm afraid I'm going to do not too much of that. I'm going to concentrate on Cervantes mainly. And one thing that's always intrigued me is the tremendous influence that this one book seems to have had, not just on the literature in which it was, the language in which it was written, but also worldwide. In fact, Don Quixote was an immediate success. Very shortly after it was published, it was actually ready by Christmas 1604, but on the cover it says 1605, so we assume it was ready by the beginning of 1605, say around about January. It very soon became hugely popular in Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. And I don't just mean among the reading public, of which it was only really a minority, but in the streets, among the people. Already on the 28th of June, 1605, we have a record of figures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza appearing in street pageants. And 2 years later, there's another record in 1607 of the two figures appearing in street pageants in Peru, no less, and so on and so forth. And its fame spread abroad very quickly. We've heard how in 1605 an English delegation was in Spain and brought back at least one copy of the first edition of Don Quixote, which now resides here in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and this arrived back here in Oxford in August of 1605. The English translation, as we've heard, appeared in 1612, the French in 1614. And its influence on subsequent generations of writers throughout Europe is nothing short of amazing. We've already heard this morning about its early influence in England, notably in the case of the history of Cardenio, which Professor Hammond has so expertly analysed for us. And I could easily take up my allotted time today with a roll call of writers who have acknowledged its importance and influence. But I hope it'll suffice to have recourse to that master of hyperbole, the American critic Harold Bloom, to give you an idea of the kind of extravagant praise that has been heaped on this one book. And I quote, "This great book contains within itself all the novels that have followed in its sublime wake. Like Shakespeare," here's my reference to Shakespeare, I thought I should include that, "Cervantes is inescapable for all writers who have come after him. Dickens and Flaubert, Joyce and Proust reflect the narrative procedures of Cervantes, and their glories of characterization mingle strains of Shakespeare and Cervantes." Now that's a huge, and I'm sure you'll agree, an arguable claim. But it's clear that Don Quixote's influence on the development of the novel has been enormous. And its influence goes far beyond literature in ways that few works of fiction have managed to do. The story of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza has inspired artists in a wide range of media: poetry, drama, ballet, opera, but also painting, sculpture, film, and even in the more popular media of television, the musical, remember Man of La Mancha, animated cartoons and comic strips. Cervantes, one might say, has achieved, and let's use that cliche, the status of a universal writer. And this almost in a literal sense, I discovered only last month, because a new star, which has been discovered not so long ago in an exo world, I'm not quite sure what that is, but it still exists somewhere out there, a new star has been given the name Cervantes. And that star actually has 4 planets in its orbit, orbiting it. And you guessed, those planets are called Don Quixote, Sancho Panza, Dulcinea, and even Rocinante. All of this begs the question: how could this one book have the power to exert such enormous influence on literature and the arts for over 400 years? This is a large, complex, multifaceted question, but for the purpose of this all too brief paper, I will argue today that the source of the book's power lies in the madness of Don Quixote. Cervantes' declared aim was to discredit the romances of chivalry, and he chose to do so, as we all know, through parody and burlesque. The basic premise of the parody was that an old gentleman of La Mancha goes mad from reading too many books of chivalry and ends up believing that they are literally and absolutely true. Now, books of chivalry had captivated the European imagination since the genre was invented in the 12th century by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. At the core of the genre lies the hero's quest for honor and glory, a quest inspired by his love for a beautiful and virtuous lady, and guided almost invariably to a happy conclusion by a benevolent providence. Cervantes was certainly not the first writer to parody the romances of chivalry. Some might argue that even Chrétien de Troyes himself, in one or two of his poetic romances, introduces burlesque elements. And of course, the great exemplar of burlesque, of chivalric romance, was Ludovico Ariosto in his Orlando Furioso, a book which Cervantes greatly admired and which he alludes to on several occasions and borrows from in his great work. But it was the Spaniard's brilliant idea of making his hero mad that made the critical difference, in my view. For the ideal world of chivalry was condensed at a stroke into a reality existing nowhere else but inside the madman's head. That brilliant stroke had several important consequences, not least the fact that it produced one of the most enduring themes of modern fiction, the clash of illusion and reality. But the consequence I want to emphasize today, for the purposes of this paper, is that since the quest for glory is no more than an absurd fantasy in the mind of a lunatic, Cervantes had no pattern or model, beyond a certain point, to give shape to his own narrative. Writing Don Quixote was, in effect, a great venture into the unknown, a process of improvisation and invention which evolved through different phases as its author explored the possibilities opened up for him by the strange obsession that had taken hold of his would-be hero. The story of Don Quixote is also the story of how Cervantes progressively discovered the potentialities of the knight's madness. At first sight, such an absurd madness would appear to leave very little room for development. It's just a device, a laughable fantasy, whose purpose is simply to enable the parody of the books of chivalry. So long as Don Quixote believes the nonsense that these books are true histories, he will be mad. But there is a further level to the madness, and I don't think this has been noticed sufficiently. And I'm going to quote, "By now, quite insane, he conceived the strangest notion that ever took shape in a madman's head, considering it desirable and necessary both for the increase of his honour and for the common good, to become a knight-errant and to travel the world with his armour and his arms and his horse in search of adventures." Cervantes then is quite clear that there are two levels to the madness, one passive and the other active. The first level is the passive belief in the absolute truth of the books of chivalry. The second level is the belief that he can himself become a knight-errant and set forth to restore the world of chivalry he's read about in the books. This secondary belief entails transforming the everyday world in order to make it correspond to the reality portrayed in chivalric romances. He therefore reinvents himself as Don Quixote de la Mancha, gives a new name, Rocinante, to his old nag, declares that a strapping country wench called Adolfa Lorenzo is really the beautiful princess Dulcinea del Toboso, and recruits a fat, illiterate peasant, Sancho Panza, to serve him as his squire. Don Quixote will never doubt the primary belief that the romances of chivalry are literally true, but his secondary belief, his secondary fancy that he can live his life as a knight-errant is capable of waxing and waning. And I think it is this potential for self-doubt that allowed Cervantes to take the would-be hero far beyond the limits of the buffoon he might otherwise have remained, and create one of the great characters in world literature. In part 1, which as you see was published in 1605, there is no discernible mismatch between the two levels of the madness. Don Quixote is a bumptious, self-confident fool who goes about trying to transform inns into castles, windows into giants, and so on. Failure is brushed airily off as the work of envious enchanters. The divergence between the primary and the secondary levels of the madness begins to manifest itself in part 2, chapter 10, specifically in the episode of the enchantment of Dulcinea. This is, for those of you who may be a bit rusty in the knowledge of Don Quixote, this is when Don Quixote, as I like to call him, that's how I was taught to pronounce it when I was an undergraduate, it's ingrained in me, I'm afraid. Don Quixote decides to visit El Toboso to pay his respects to the Princess Dulcinea, the lady of his heart. When he arrives at the village, he's expecting to see the country girl Aldonza Lorenzo transformed into her true chivalric self as Dulcinea del Toboso, because Sancho has told him that he's already had an interview with Dulcinea del Toboso. I think critics tend to forget this. This is why Don Quixote is coming, because he believes that Aldonza has already been transformed into Dulcinea, according to what Sancho has told him in chapter 25 of part 1. Now, Dulcinea, of course, does not exist, but Sancho pulls off an amazingly daring trick, claiming 3 peasant girls who happen to be riding by on donkeys are none other than the Lady Dulcinea and her maidservants. When Don Quixote says he can see only 3 uncouth and ugly girls, Sancho proceeds to describe the lady's beauty with great relish. So the Mad Knight, as Sancho rightly assumed, concludes that an evil enchanter must have cast a spell on Dulcinea. In his famous book, Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature, I think the subtitle is significant, the great German critic Erich Auerbach observed that this episode holds a central place in the novel. But he argues that even though the situation may seem sad, bitter, almost tragic, Cervantes treats it in a farcical manner. I quote, "We have a farce, and a farce that is overwhelmingly comic. Even though," says Auerbach, "the possibility of a shift into the tragic and problematic exists, such a shift is definitely avoided by Don Quixote, because the fact that the knight automatically takes refuge in the interpretation that Dulcinea is under enchantment excludes everything tragic." In Auerbach's view, Don Quixote's madness, I quote, "transforms the real everyday world into a gay stage. Even though it belongs," he says, "in an epoch during which the modern problematic and tragic conception of things arose in the European mind, there is very little of problem and tragedy in Cervantes' book." Now, Auerbach was one of the first of a number of 20th century anti-romantic critics of the Quixote. And in this refusal to admit pathos, let alone tragic qualities, in the novel, he was followed by a number of Cervantes scholars who persisted in rejecting what they called the romantic interpretation because they believed it traduced Cervantes' original intention of writing a funny book. The problem, in my view, with the anti-romantic critics is that they were too distracted by the episodic structure of the novel and failed to appreciate the dynamic continuities that underlie the episodes. Auerbach, for instance, focused on the episode of the enchanted Dulcinea and gave only the most cursory attention to anything that preceded or followed that one scene. Likewise, his followers didn't pursue a consistent analysis of the causal development of the narrative from beginning to end. I think they were too selective in the episodes they discussed, treating them as discrete units rather than as an unfolding train of events. However, it's my belief that by following the entire arc of the relationship between knight and squire, one arrives at a quite different impression of Cervantes' intentions and of the overall significance of Don Quixote. To begin with, I think it is perverse not to acknowledge the pathos in Don Quixote's deception by Sancho. When the squire describes the alleged beauty and finery of Dulcinea, the poor knight laments his blindness. "And to think I could not see any of that, Sancho. I say it again, and I shall say it 1,000 times, I am the most unfortunate of men." This is not a chance remark. It constitutes a critical turning point in the story, for Cervantes from now on will remind the reader at the beginning of almost every chapter of Part 2 that Don Quixote is sunk in melancholy and depression over the enchantment of his lady. Sancho's lie cuts Don Quixote to the quick because it goes right to the heart of his enterprise to restore the world of chivalry in 17th century Spain. He had come to El Toboso expecting to see Dulcinea in all her glory, but he's faced instead with a vulgar rustic and her companions. All his efforts to restore the world of chivalry, to transform the everyday world, appear to have come to naught. From now on, he will begin to doubt his capacity to become a hero. Yet, even though he's increasingly plagued by doubts about his destiny, he still believes as strongly as ever in the truth of the books of chivalry. So he will continue to say and do things that make him a laughingstock. These fluctuations between comedy and pathos will become characteristic of the whole of Part 2, differentiating it from Part 1. Even so, Dulcinea will remain the central focus of his aspirations, and his anxiety to release her from the evil spell will motivate all his endeavours in Part 2. Time and again, he will look for signs that Providence will favour him, but he will never, ever be given a clear sign of favour. Sancho's lie, Sancho's manipulation of Don Quixote's madness, is a sign that he's lost his sense of deference towards his master, and he too will become an ambivalent character. He may still be an amusing rustic, but we're also aware that he can be a cunning and self-interested rogue. It was Salvador de Madariaga who observed that if Dulcinea becomes the centre of Don Quixote's concerns in Part 2, Sancho is driven by material greed and social ambition. Madariaga called this development the rise of Sancho in Part 2. The squire becomes increasingly self-assured, and his plain desire is to gain the promised island in order to rise in society. What binds the pair now is not the deference that a squire traditionally owed a knight, but a web of competing interests which shifts according to circumstances and so anticipates the ambiguous motivation of modern characters. The two are locked in a relationship in which the destiny of each one critically depends on the other. A relationship in which there is dialogue and conflict, affection but also envious rivalry, and which Cervantes will come to use as a prism through which to observe and to criticize his own society. It's a short paper, so I'll skip quite a lot of incidents and simply say that the social ascent of Sancho, the rise of Sancho, reaches its climax at the Duke's palace, where, as several scholars have pointed out, a kind of world upside down is created as a result of the various tricks and hoaxes to which the knight and squire are subjected. When the Duke awards Sancho the governorship of the island of Barataria, and Don Quixote gets nothing at all, the hierarchical relationship of knight and squire is turned on its head. An inversion of power and status that effectively contradicts and overturns the traditional narrative system of chivalric romance since it was invented by Chrétien de Troyes. Had Cervantes opted to bring the novel to an end at this point, the Quixote would not have lost any of its coherence as a parody of the romances of chivalry. Nevertheless, Cervantes decided to continue the story. But he must have realized that there was a problem, and that problem was Sancho. Having tasted power as governor of an island, what incentive was there for Sancho to return to the service of a man he knew by now, was quite mad? None, of course. But the problem of Sancho's motivation was made far worse by a hoax played by the Duke on the unsuspecting pair. I'm referring to the episode when one of the Duke's servants, disguised as Merlin, prophesies that the enchanted Dulcinea will be released from her spell when Sancho whips himself 3,300 times on his backside. We've got some of the scatological humour that was referred to by Professor Pujante some time ago. Merlin's prophecy is comically absurd, of course, but it entrenches within the Quixote-Sancho relationship the world upside down created at the Duke's palace. For by giving Sancho its exclusive power to liberate Dulcinea, the knight will become dependent on his servant for the one thing that matters most to him in this world, the release of his lady from her enchantment. Cervantes obviously realized that Merlin's prophecy put master and servant on a collision course, and indeed the inevitable clash occurs in chapter 60. Don Quixote becomes so frustrated with Sancho's refusal to apply Merlin's remedy that he tries to whip the squire himself. Sancho reacts with great fury, wrestles Don Quixote to the ground, they're actually physically fighting, places his knee on his master's chest to hold him down. Don Quixote is horrified. "What, you traitor? You defy your own natural lord? You raised your hand against the man who feeds you?" But Sancho remains defiant. "I'll help myself," he replies. "I'm my own lord." Amazingly, Don Quixote yields to Sancho's ultimatum and promises never to lay hands on him again. There is no interpretation of the Quixote that takes this shocking fight into account. Madariaga called it, I quote, "one page which every reader of Don Quixote would wish unwritten." Other than a few passing comments here and there, you will not find much extensive discussion of this clash. And the reason, I believe, why Cervantes scholars have averted their collective gaze from this distressing episode is that it violates the deeply entrenched notion of a growing fraternal bond between the protagonists. And yet I believe this is one of the crucial scenes in the Quixote, and its consequences deserve much closer analysis. After all, Sancho's violent rebellion against his master is no isolated incident. It is the logical outcome of his rise to power in Part 2. And why does Don Quixote surrender to Sancho in this fight? Because he realizes his dependence on Sancho's will, given Merlin's prophecy. Sancho has the real power now, and in this scene he achieves complete dominance over his mad master, who must thenceforth accept his impotence to determine his own destiny. Cervantes would have understood that Merlin's prophecy would compel him, logically, to maintain the inversion between master and servant for as long as Don Quixote remained mad, and that this inversion might eventually result in the destruction of the knight at the hands of his squire. Once again, Cervantes could have avoided that fate by bringing the story to an end at that point. And once again, he chose not to. I won't go into the reasons why. What he did was to postpone the issue by sending the pair to Barcelona and distracting the reader's attention with the introduction of new characters, interpolating stories, interpolating episodes. But towards the end of their stay in Barcelona, Don Quixote is challenged to a duel by someone calling himself the Knight of the White Moon, and he suffers a defeat at the hands of the knight. He's made to promise to return to his home village and to give up arms for a year. As Don Quixote prepares to set off for home, Cervantes makes him reflect on his defeat. I quote, this is Don Quixote speaking, "Here my bad luck and my cowardice deprived me of the glory I had won. Here did I feel the fickleness of fortune. Here the lustre of my exploits was obscured. Here, in short, my joy came crashing to the ground, never again to rise." Sancho concurs in this disillusioned view of human destiny. "I've heard say," he says, "that what they call fortune is a flighty woman who drinks too much, and what's more, she's blind, so she can't see what she's doing and doesn't know who she's knocking over or who she's raising up." This exchange, in the context of chivalric romance, reveals, in my view, how the spiritual order that regulated the genre has disintegrated by this point in the Quixote. And it's significant that it is Don Quixote himself who recognizes that Providence has been conspicuous by its absence in the unfolding of his career. He now ponders the mystery of a world that has grown impenetrably strange and comes close to losing his faith in Providence. He pulls back from the brink, however, and reaffirms his belief in the Christian order of things. I quote, in reply to Sancho, he says, "What I can tell you is that there is no such thing as fortune, and whatever happens in this world, good and bad, doesn't occur by chance, but by special providence of heaven. My presumption is what led me to disaster." Yet, I find it interesting that Don Quixote's momentary doubt has been signalled by Cervantes. It's a momentary doubt, but it's a doubt that, in my view, breaches, however briefly, the belief system of Catholic Spain. For if one dispenses with Providence, what's left? The whims of fortune, as Sancho cynically declares. The journey home occupies the last 8 chapters from chapter 66 to chapter 73. We now enter a phase in the novel. We now enter a new phase in the novel, yet once again, Cervantes scholars, in my view, have given this phase very little sustained attention, and I think for the same reason. It's hard to square what happens in these chapters either with a sentimental view of the Quixote-Sancho relationship or even with an unproblematic funny book approach. Vladimir Nabokov famously decried the cruelty of Cervantes' novel. There is so much violence and physical knockabout, beatings, woundings, injuries, all kinds of bodily humiliations and accidents. And he thought it was a very, very cruel book. But I think that the greatest cruelty comes in this last phase. And its cruelty is not so much physical, which it is, because the point you will recall where Quixote and Sancho are trampled by no fewer than 600 pigs. But the greatest cruelty is not so much physical as psychological and moral. For here, finally, Cervantes chose to draw out the awful consequences of Merlin's prophecy and describe the decline and fall of the would-be hero of romance. In this last phase, the two characters exist in a kind of social void. Sancho's victory over his master in chapter 60 had effectively destroyed the hierarchical difference between them. "I am my own lord," Sancho had declared. And it's pitiful to observe the knight's painful coming to terms with his loss of status. Cervantes will portray a tense, fraught relationship as the knight strives to maintain a semblance of his authority, while the squire resists such pretensions. And little by little, step by step, there's no time to go step by step today, but little by little, he disengages himself from the crazy world of his master's imagination. He dismantles, you could use a fashionable term, he deconstructs the whole beautiful poetic world of chivalry, which exists only in his master's or former master's head, with all its fantasies of wicked enchanters, its codes of chivalry and courtly love, and courtly behavior, and its exaltation of platonic love. In chapter 68, Don Quixote complains about Sancho's insensitivity to his suffering. I quote, "I imagine you must be made of marble or of hard bronze, and incapable of passion or feeling. I watch while you sleep. I weep while you sing. I faint from fasting while you are sluggish and torpid out of pure satiety. It's up to good servants to share their master's griefs and feel their sorrows." Yet again he urges Sancho to whip himself, but the peasant rejects any sense of a shared fate between knight and squire. He says, "What have the panthers got to do with the Quixotes?" Don Quixote laments the breakdown of their feudal relationship. He says, "Oh, you stony-hearted creature! Oh, you pitiless squire! Oh, what a waste of the food and the favours I've lavished on you and still intend to lavish on you." In the next chapter it gets even worse. We see Don Quixote falling to his knees and imploring Sancho once more to rescue Dulcinea from her bewitched condition. Once again the scene has been largely ignored. Certainly it's shocking to see the knight on his knees pleading with Sancho in such an abject fashion. But equally shocking is the fact that Sancho is unmoved by his master's despair. Instead, he turns to exploiting it for material gain. When Don Quixote offers to pay him for each lash that he administers to his backside, he eagerly negotiates a price for each of the lashes. The knight is grovelling in gratitude, and listen to what he says. "O blessed Sancho, O kindly Sancho, Dulcinea and I shall be under an obligation to serve you for so long as heaven spares us." So what Don Quixote is doing, incredibly, is putting his lady love, the lady of his heart, the focus of all his energy, and himself at the service of Sancho Panza, the former servant, for as long as they both live. We witness here a truly grotesque inversion of the original pact between them. Don Quixote promises that not only he, but Dulcinea too will serve Sancho for the rest of their days. And even now, Sancho is capable of deceiving the poor madman. He goes off into a wood and starts whipping tree trunks, emitting great howls of feigned agony. Sancho Panza's indifference to Don Quixote's plight is a surprising and uncomfortable revelation at this stage. He seems, in my view, to have been vitiated by the web of lies he spun round his master in the course of part 2. As Madariaga pointed out, he's become deceitful and greedy, and he evidently regards his career as something of a triumph. "I'll go back home rich and happy, though soundly whipped," he says when he accepts that deal with Don Quixote. And when he finally arrives back home, he declares to his wife, "I've brought money back with me, and that's what counts. And I've earned it with my own wiles without harming anybody." Teresa Panza approves of her husband's greed and says, "So long as you've brought money back, dear husband, you can have earned it this way or that for all I care. However you've earned it, you won't have started up any new customs in this world." Nabokov, as I've said, thought that Don Quixote was an extremely cruel book. Thomas Mann thought so too. And Mann made a curious observation regarding the nature of the comic in Cervantes' novel, which I think is worth quoting. "Does not all this cruelty look like self-flagellation, self-revilement, castigation? Yes, it seems to me as though here the author abandons to scorn his oft-flouted belief in the human being and his ennoblement. It seems to me that this grim coming to terms with reality is actually the definition of humour." I've long been intrigued by this notion of Thomas Mann's, that Cervantes' cruelty may be a form of self-flagellation, that his humour might stem from a scorning of Cervantes' own beliefs in the nobility of man in order to come to terms with a grim reality. But what reality could this be? Well, I'll just try and explore this idea. In the penultimate chapter, Cervantes depicts a scene that is, in my view, too poignant to admit of any trace of comedy. At this point, Sancho has fooled the madman into believing that he has completed the number of lashes prescribed by Merlin for the liberation of Dulcinea. As they approach their home village, Don Quixote scrutinizes, we are told, every woman they pass on the road to see, I quote, if it might be Dulcinea del Toboso, because he was absolutely certain that Merlin's promises could not be false. At the entrance to the village, he becomes so distressed by what he takes to be a bad omen, the sight of hounds chasing a hare, that instead of expressing himself with his former eloquence, he can hardly bring himself to mutter, malum signum, hare flees, greyhounds chase, Dulcinea appears not. The fractured syntax, it's more fractured in the Spanish, betrays the extremity of the knight's despair at this point. Sancho tries to console him, but the squire cannot comprehend the horror of Don Quixote's situation. The knight's chivalric quest has been completely emptied of meaning. He's reached the furthest limit of his madness and come up against the void. Dulcinea no parece. This is horrible enough, But the full horror lies in the fact that he still, nevertheless, believes that the books of chivalry are absolutely true. He says, the narrator says, because he was absolutely certain that Merlin's promises could not be false. In other words, he is impaled on his primary madness, and this blind, broken state could, in principle, last forever, because his unbending faith in the truth of the books prevents him from reasoning his way out of the dead end, the nothingness to which his chivalric quest has led. In the last chapter, the old gentleman is cured of his madness before dying a good Christian death. But it's worth noting that this ideological correction is brought about by a miracle. The old Hidalgo recovers his sanity thanks to a mysterious illness which appears like literally a deus ex machina and closes the window on the terrible void in which the knight's madness has led. I would say that the spectre of tragedy hovers about the last chapters of the Quixote. Indeed, the so-called romantic interpretation, which has been so disparaged by some critics, has a certain textual justification in this phase. However, if the novel is not entirely comic, neither can it become properly tragic, because the knight's madness is unarguably absurd. It's intrinsically absurd. And yet I believe it is this profound ambivalence which has invested the novel with its unique power. For what stands out ever more poignantly until the final miraculous cure is Don Quixote's unwavering belief in the authority of the books of chivalry. This is precisely the belief that makes him mad, but it is also why Cervantes makes him cleave to Dulcinea with a strange, transcendent zeal. Dulcinea is the embodiment of a knight's lunatic quest to rise above the common order of reality and achieve the overmastering glory described in the books. Even in defeat, he will refuse to renounce his lady. Cast down to the ground by the Knight of the White Moon, and with a lance pointed at his breast, Don Quixote will insist, I quote, "Dulcinea is the most beautiful woman in the world, and I am the most unfortunate knight in it. Drive your lance home, Sir Knight, and take away my life, since you have taken away my honour." The words of the fallen knight, we're told, rise as from a tomb. They rise from his shuttered helmet. And I think there's no better, more forceful image to capture the blind futility of his passion for this figment of his imagination. The fact that Cervantes uses that image shows that pathos, that sense of wanting to convey Don Quixote's mad zeal to love Dulcinea and not renounce her, was part of his ultimate intentions, his evolving and ultimate intentions in the Quixote. To conclude, Cervantes' novel is indeed a funny book, and absolutely it is a funny book. It's a parody, it's a burlesque, it is a funny book, but the general comic atmosphere is finally distilled into a timeless tragic moment in which the hero is condemned to make a fool of himself with no hope even of knowing why. This is the paradox that has proved, in my view, so fascinating to the modern imagination. This is what gives the Mad Knight his special power and makes him comparable to Shakespeare's Hamlet or Lear or Macbeth. This ultimately is why Cervantes, why Don Quixote, Sancho Panza, Dulcinea, and even the old nag Rocinante now have their place among the stars. So